Hi, everyone, and welcome to RoundTable's Burns Night celebration. I am Gina Marie Jameson. I am the Executive Director of RoundTable Cultural Seminars, and right next to me, I have Caitlin Salazzo, our Seminars Coordinator. If you have not been with us before, RoundTable Cultural Seminars is a New York-based 501c3 adult education nonprofit. Our goal is to promote lifelong learning to people of all ages and all walks of life. We offer seminar series 3 times a year, the fall, the winter, and the spring. And since we've moved online due to the pandemic, we've been offering free community-based programming, including our First Friday series, as well as special events such as Burns Night. We're going to get started in just one moment, but I want to go over a little bit about what we're going to do together today. First off, that was the Dark Isle Piper playing a beautiful song for us. And don't you worry, you will be getting all of her information should you wish to buy one of her CDs or follow her on Facebook. She is an amazing performer. Her name is Tress, and I highly recommend if you are an appreciative person of bagpipe music to definitely check her out. So we'll be sending you all those links afterwards if you would like to look up the Dark Isle Piper. The next thing I'd like to go over very quick as we kick off our Burns Night is I want to introduce everybody to the Selkirk Grace, which is traditionally what you do at a Burns Night dinner, how you start. So if you have your whiskey, your scotch like I do, because it's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? And want to say it with me, we'll go over it very, very quickly. Again, this is the traditional kickoff to a Burns Night celebration. Some ha meat and canna eat, and some would eat that want it. But we ha meat and we can eat. Say, let the Lord be thanked. Cheers, everybody. Caitlin didn't get her scotch out. We have some amazing performances from actors who are all Scottish. Some are based in the US, some are based in Scotland. And we have another bagpipe performer for you. The Master Piper will be on with us. And most importantly, we have Dr. Kelsey Jackson-Williams, who is coming to us all the way from the University of Stirling to do a presentation on Robert Burns, which is why we're here celebrating today. Traditionally at a Burns Night supper, one of the most famous poems that you will do is Address to a Haggis. I have the actress Polly McKee performing for you Address to a Haggis. Polly is an amazing acting teacher based in New York City at HB Studios. She is also an actor of her own right. She is originally from Scotland. She is an educator, an artist, and an all-around amazing person. And I can't wait for you to enjoy Address to a Haggis. Here we go.
Fair fire on his sonsy face, great chieftain of the puddin' race, aboon them all ye tack your place, pains tripe or fairm, weel are you wordy o' grace as lang's my airm. The groaning trencher there you fill, your hurdies like a distant hill, your pin would help to mend a mill in time of need, while through your pores the dews distill like amber bead. His knife see your rustic labour dight and catch ye up with a ready sleight, trenching your gushing entrails bright like ony ditch. And then, oh, what a glorious sight, warm, reeking, rich. Then horn for horn they stretch and strive, they'll take the hindmost on they drive, till all their wheel-swelled kites belive are bent like drums. Then old good man maist like to arrive, be thankit hums. Is there the hour his French ragout or olio that would staw a sou, or fricassee would mak her spew with perfect scunner, looks down with sneering scornful view and sick a dinner? Poor deal. See him o'er his trash as feckless as a withered rash, his spindle shank a good whip lash, his knee van knit. through bloody flood or field to dash, oh, how unfit. But mark the rustic haggis fed, the trembling earth resounds his tread, clapping his wally neve a blade, he'll mak it whistle, and legs and arms and heads will sned like taps of thistle. Ye powers wha make mankind your care, and dish them out their bill of fare. Auld Scotland wants nae skinking ware that jops in luggies. But if you wish her grateful prayer, gear a haggis.
That was just so enjoyable. I mean, thank you, Polly, for that. I hope you all enjoyed that with your Scotch and whiskey at home. Right now, we're going to bring on Kelsey and get started with this fantastic presentation on Robert Burns. I'm going to bring Kelsey up as well as his presentation and hand it over to Caitlin, who's going to walk us through how to ask questions and leave comments during our session today. Here we go.
Like Gina said, welcome everyone. I have to admit, I'm not a Scotch drinker, but maybe this event will make a whiskey drinker out of me yet. So here's hoping. Like Gina said, questions and comments are most definitely encouraged throughout today's session. I can see plenty of folks have already dropped a comment through YouTube Live. So if you haven't found the comment box yet and you're watching us on a computer screen, you may have to exit full screen mode just for a moment, know that. To the right of the box, you see the three of us on. There's space where you can type whatever you'd like. Click the blue chat button and that will come up to us. Once Kelsey's completed this presentation today, Gina and I will come back on and we'll address those questions. I'll pop them right up on screen, maybe give you a little shout out too if you put your name. If that's a little too complicated or maybe you're not on a computer, that's okay. There's two other ways you can ask some questions today. The first is you can send an email to us. The address is office@roundtableculturalseminars.org. Same rules apply. I'll get it to Kelsey at the end of today's session. If you have your cell phone handy though, and this is probably the easiest way, you can send a text that Gina and I will get on our computers to the number 646-450-0986. And same thing, equal opportunity. I will get that up to Casey after he's concluded his presentation today. If that's a little confusing, don't worry. I'll say it all again at the end. But for right now, I'll take myself off. I'll take Gina off and I will give Casey the stage. Casey, it's all you.
Thank you, Caitlin. And well, if I'd known that we were going to be opening bottles, I'd have poured myself a dram before this. But thank you very much, Caitlin and Gina. It's a pleasure to be here. So, Robert Burns is one of those literary figures, like Shakespeare, whose words are so ubiquitous that we probably know them, even if we know nothing about Burns himself. Certainly, if you've ever sung Auld Lang Syne to welcome in the new year, or if you've ever plagiarized the sentiments of My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose for a Valentine's Day card, then you've taken part in Burns's cultural legacy. And today, I want to talk about that legacy, particularly as it becomes crystallized in the Burns Supper in Burns Night, which is a slightly odd event by anyone's standard, but one which is enjoyed or endured or something by millions of people around the world each year. And before we get to the myth of Burns, though, let's actually talk a little bit about the man himself. Robert Burns was born on the 25th of January, 1759. That date's going to become important later on, at Alloway in Ayrshire in the southwest of Scotland. His family were educated but struggling tenant farmers, a class which perhaps existed a little bit more then than it did before or after. And crucially, the community he was born into was both rural and Scots-speaking. Now, this is the first point where I should probably make a small diversion to explain what I mean. Outside of the United Kingdom, I don't think it's particularly well known that Scotland has two native languages besides English. One, Gaelic, is sadly in terminal decline and is spoken by about 1.7% of the population today. And oddly, this is the one most people know about. But the other, Scots, is spoken by 38% of the population, so over a third, and is often misunderstood as a dialect of English. Now, the reason for that is that Scots is a sister language of English in the terms of the linguists, meaning that they descend from a common proto-language, in this case the Anglo-Frisian tongues of the early Middle Ages. And due to 1,000 or more years of coexistence alongside English, Scots has remained sufficiently in touch with its sister language that the two languages are sort of understandable to each other's speakers. But I mean, that said, if I were to tell you that I'm on gay to the brig, I'm not sure it would be immediately obvious that I was saying I must go to the bridge. And once we get into poetry in Scots, as you probably saw in that wonderful rendition of the Address to the Haggis, that comprehension gap between the languages grows even wider. So, when I say then that Burns grew up in a Scots-speaking community, and indeed most of lowland Scotland was monolingually Scots-speaking in the 18th century, you'll see why this is actually very important. He was part of a vibrant Scots literary culture, both written and oral, which stretched back to the Middle Ages. But he was also living in the era of union. Remember, Scotland and England were unified in 1707, and Anglicizing tendencies were rampant in the new United Kingdom. So that Burns, having received a reasonably good education by the standards of his time, could speak and write in English just as fluently as he could in Scots. And indeed, his first, admittedly not particularly good, attempts at poetry as a teenager are very much in the stilted poetic diction of 18th century England. But Burns wasn't a man of leisure who could sit back and write poems to his heart's content. His family's straitened circumstances meant that he was a ploughman on his father's farm from an early age, and after his father's death, joint tenant with his brother on a boggy, cold, and altogether unappetizing piece of land named Mossgiel, not far from his birthplace. It was about this time that he made two decisions which would have unexpected and long-ranging consequences, both for him and for his legacy. One was to join a local lodge of Freemasons, and the other was to begin sleeping with a girl named Jean Armour, whose father didn't approve of Burns one bit, let it be said. Now, despite the challenges of Scottish farming, Burns was also writing poetry at this time and already planning the publication of his first collection of poems, which was entitled Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect. You have to remember that in the 18th century, as afterwards, Scots was often denigrated as a rustic dialect than a separate language, hence the title. And this was printed in 1786. You can see the title page of it there. Poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect consisted of 44 poems, mostly in Scots, some in English, and it sold out in a month, which was pretty good going for a volume of poetry by an unknown author, whether in 1786 or any other year. And indeed, the £50 Burns made off it was nothing to sniff at in those days, but it was the publicity following on from this publication that fundamentally changed his life. Fed up with Ayrshire, farming, his tempestuous relationship with Jean Armour, not to mention other relationships with several other local women, Burns had been thinking of immigrating to Jamaica in the year of his book's publication. And of course, his career would have been very different had he done so. But by the end of 1786, that plan was forgotten. Instead, he was in Edinburgh, in Scotland's capital, being feted by the literary lions of the day in planning the second edition of his works, which was published soon after. Now, you would have expected this to lead to a literary career in the capital, but that wasn't to be the case, and the reason, I'm afraid, was entirely one of class. Working-class poets weren't unknown in the 18th century, but they were expected to follow a predictable model. The untaught natural genius whose works were discovered by the elite, and who then gratefully enjoyed their patronage as a result. Burns, however, was too proud and too ambitious to fit that kind of model. As Sir Walter Scott, the novelist, later remembered, in Edinburgh drawing rooms, Burns expressed perfect self-confidence and perfect firmness, and when he differed in opinion, he did not hesitate to express it firmly, yet at the same time with modesty. Writing when Burns was long dead and his star was well in the ascendant, Scott could see all of this as a virtue. But the Edinburgh elites of the 1780s took rather less kindly to this very forthright, uncompromising young man, who quite clearly saw himself as the equal, if not the superior, of the company around him. So instead of fame, Burns had to settle for a modest improvement in circumstances. Better than nothing, anyway. His new network of acquaintances found him a post in the excise, keeping an eye on the endemic smuggling which plagued Scotland's coast, as well as a slightly better farm, where he settled with Jean Armour, to whom he was now married after at least 2 false starts. Jean's father, continuing not to approve of Burns, had ripped up the first attempt at a marriage paper. He was also editing the Scots Musical Museum, a multi-volume collection of traditional Scottish songs, which is now recognised as one of the most important of its kind. He was writing more poetry, but nonetheless was feeling very low and, to quote him, at the very elbow of existence. In 1791, Burns gave up farming entirely and moved with his growing family to the nearby town of Dumfries, where he continued his duties as an exciseman. This is still in the southwest of Scotland. You can see a view of it there as it appeared in about Burns's time. This was the time, you'll remember, 1780s, 1790s, of the French Revolution, and British politicians were feeling increasingly twitchy at the prospect of something similar happening on their home turf. And not without reason, to be fair. It was an era of radical movements, of belief in universal human equality, and of the potential progress of the human race. It's in this context that we should read some of Burns's most radical poems, including A Man's a Man for All That, which you may be familiar with its lines, "Then let us pray that come it may, as come it will for all that sense and worth o'er all the earth shall bear the gree and all that, for all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for all that." More specifically, anti-unionist, anti-British note was sounded in his Robert Bruce's March to Bannockburn, which, while ostensibly about the 14th century wars of independence, contained stanzas which could hardly have sat well with the establishment at the same time the French were busy chopping off noblemen's heads. "By oppression's woes and pains, by your sons and servile chains, we will drain our dearest veins, but they shall be free. Lay the proud usurpers low, tyrants fall and every foe, liberties in every blow, let us do or die." So, pretty strong stuff. And fortunately, while his radicalism did lead to an investigation on the part of his superiors in the excise, he managed to not only avoid a trial, but even keep his job, which was quite lucky in an era when treason trials were a very real thing and executions were not unknown. Nonetheless, the 14-hour days of an exciseman riding cross-country in the particularly hard winter of 1795, with its blizzards and 30-foot snowdrifts, began to tell on poor Burns, as indeed did his increasingly heavy drinking. That's tea, by the way. Retroactive diagnoses are dangerous business, but it looks as if that winter Burns suffered from a case of rheumatic fever and inflammation of the heart and joints, probably following on from an untreated, as how could it have been, strep throat. From then on, he frequently complains in his letters of constant pain and was more and more confined to his own home. On 21st of July 1796, he died there, probably of rheumatic heart disease following on from the fever, at the comparatively young age of 37. Jean Armour and several of their children survived him, as did several illegitimate children by various other partners. And that, in a nutshell, is the story of Burns's life. Not a terribly happy story, really. But Burns's own life was rapidly, almost instantaneously, you could say, overshadowed by his posthumous reputation. The biographies, later editions of poems, and other works which followed his death quickly established a narrative in which the heaven-taught plowman, to use a phrase which regularly appears, was a natural genius, but a self-destructive, vaguely immoral one. Now, this goes back to what I said before about how working-class poets were portrayed in the 18th century. Not only were they meant to be grateful to their patrons, which Burns wasn't, they were also meant to be respectable and virtuous. One could call Burns many things, but with his 7 illegitimate children and fondness for the bottle, it would be difficult to describe him as either respectable or virtuous. Accordingly, early biographers of Burns managed to both praise and censure him at the same time, almost as if they were frustrated that their subject failed to fit the expected mold. As Burns's reputation grew over the first half of the 19th century, this original tension amongst biographers fragmented into multiple Burnses, you could say. Burns the champion of the people, Burns the classless Scottish icon, Burns the radical, Burns the conservative, as each part of Scottish society attempted, with more or less success, to claim the poet for themselves. This is still vividly present in the Scottish urban landscape today, as the many statues of Burns erected around the country in the 19th century were each sculpted with a particular image of the poet in mind. You can see the 1882 statue of Burns in Dumfries, the town where he was an exciseman, which I think leans more towards the sort of thoughtful poet type than it does any other image of Burns. But I'm getting ahead of myself by talking about this, because the origins of the Burns Supper lie much closer to the poet's own time. Before I trace the development of the institution, though, I want to take a quick look at the Burns Supper as it exists today. So what exactly is it that we're trying to make sense of here? Now, a Burns Supper is, as you might expect, a meal with a bit extra tacked on. In its simplest form, the Master of Ceremonies, whoever they may be, delivers the Selkirk Grace, with which we started the program. 17th century Scots Grace popularized, albeit not written by Burns, after which the guests tuck into their starters. Now, the main course consists of neeps, so turnips, tatties, potatoes, and the infamous haggis, which you can see front and center on the screen there, a pudding made of sheep's organs minced with oatmeal and spices and crammed into a hollowed out animal's stomach. Now, I grant you, to non-Scots, this probably doesn't seem terribly appetizing, but I swear it is actually very good. The haggis, of course, is ceremoniously piped into the room, rather like this delightful image from a local Burns night in the 1970s, not far from where Burns lived, by a bagpiper as everyone stands. When it's laid down on the table, one of the party recites the address to a haggis, which we heard earlier, and everyone tucks in, usually with a generous supply of whiskey to hand. Once the meal's finished, one of the leading members of the party will then usually give a speech on Burns, his life and his poetry, called The Immortal Memory. You could say this is kind of what I'm doing right now, and that's sort of very much their own, whether it's serious or jocular, what aspects it focuses on. And this is then, especially in more recent times, been followed by an address to the lassies and a reply to the laddies, a chance for the men and women at the party to poke some gentle or not so gentle fun at each other. And then, once everybody's properly full of food and drink, a vote of thanks is given, everybody sings Auld Lang Syne, and they go on their merry way. Now, even in that radically summarized version, you can tell this is quite a complex ritual. And the first thing we ought to ask ourselves, as would-be anthropologists of the Burns Supper, is how did we get to where we are today? Now that story begins 5 years, 5 years after Burns's death in the summer of 1801. When, to quote, a select party of the friends of Burns proposed to dine in the cottage in which he was born, and to offer a tribute to the memory of departed genius, unquote. You can see the cottage right there. The date they chose was the anniversary of his death, the 21st of July, and the 9 men who assembled at the cottage in Alloway were all close friends of the deceased. The whole party was stage managed by Hamilton Paul, an otherwise obscure local minister, who found himself retrospectively catapulted into fame by his involvement with the first Burns night. Now remember I mentioned earlier that Burns was a Freemason. So were the men who assembled in 1801, and that Masonic cultural context underlies the ritualistic toasts, songs, and speeches of the first Burns dinner. We sat down to a comfortable dinner, the Reverend Paul wrote, of which sheep's head and haggis formed an interesting part. The address to the haggis was read, and every toast was drank by 3 times 3. In addition, Paul delivered his own poetical toast to the memory of Robert Burns, the first immortal memory, in other words. And so already you can see here a good part of the structure of the modern-day Burns dinner in place in this first moment. After that initial celebration, the same group, the Alloa Club as they call themselves, met a second time on the 29th of January, 1802, which they incorrectly believed was Burns's birthday. We know now it was the 25th, which is the date Burns Night is now celebrated on. And on the same day, a second Burns dinner was held by some friends of theirs in Greenock, further up the coast. By 1805, so again, less than a decade after Burns had died, this had spread to Paisley in the same area. And with a decade, various old friends and new admirers of the poet were having a dozen or more annual dinners in his memory across the central belt of Scotland. These early dinners were all masterminded by individuals who had known Burns and were centered on the parts of Scotland where the poet had spent most of his life. But by the second decade of the 19th century, we start seeing a different approach. Large public dinners in cities like Glasgow or Edinburgh, where the immortal memory was a carefully staged literary event given by some major celebrity, like the poet James Hogg or the novelist Sir Walter Scott. There were still close ties to Burns, certainly, at these events. For example, at Edinburgh's Burns Supper in 1815, Hogg, always a good raconteur, not only presided and gave the various speeches, but even made a fine rum punch and Burns's own punch bowl for the assembled guests. But increasingly, the event was becoming a cultural fixture in Scotland and indeed in England, which went beyond the poet's own circle to a rather wider audience. And indeed, by the time we get to the 18 teens, the 1820s, the tradition had already spread well beyond Britain itself. There were regular Burns suppers held by Scots in Jamaica as early as 1806, but in the 1820s, the practice was sufficiently widespread across the US and Canada that over 50 suppers were being held annually or semi-annually out with Great Britain. And here we reach a very interesting point where several distinct cultural developments begin to collide. Burns suppers rapidly became naturalized in the current and former British colonies, and indeed particularly in the early the early American Republic. And the question we need to ask ourselves is why? The answer is that something very much like them already existed, and Burns was simply grafted onto this. So you might be familiar with the concept of a St. Andrew's Society, a society for Scottish immigrants and their descendants abroad. And indeed, New York has one of the older ones in America, which was established in 1756 and is still going strong. The high point of the social calendar of these groups of Scottish expats at the end of the 18th century was the St. Andrew's Night Dinner on 30th of November. And we can see in these a familiar anticipation of the Burns tradition. So to give an example, the St. Andrew's Society of Pittsburgh in 1790, quote, sat down to a haggis and a singed sheep's head, and grace being said by good old man Mr. Scott, the gully was put in the haggis reeking hot, and ilka ane had his share in his ain trencher, unquote. Various toasts were given and bits of verse were recited at this event, even, anticipatorily, a part of Robert Burns, the Ayrshire Ploughman, which was chanted by Sawney Shaw. The similarity with Hamilton Paul's dinner a few years later and its descendants, I think, is pretty obvious. So, this rapid expansion of the Burns tradition received a significant boost from the centenary of the poet's birth in 1859. Over 800 events were held around the world in 1859, which established Burns, if he needed any further establishment, not just as a key poet in Scotland's literary heritage, but as a kind of stand-in or an image for Scottish culture as a whole. A distilled, if you'll forgive the pun, representation of Scottish identity, who on the anniversary of his birth was used as a way of emphasizing shared Scottish heritage as well as a shared Scottish displacement across the globe. And by this time, excuse me, we're seeing Burns suppers everywhere within the British Empire, from India to South America and well beyond. So by the middle of the 19th century, we could say that something very much like the modern Burns supper, with its internationality and its set of rituals, had been born. And what followed was a perhaps predictable cycle of stultification, appropriation, criticism, and revival that continues into the present. Later in the 19th century, we see the Burns supper becoming increasingly codified, particularly after 1885. In 1885, a number of the then existing Burns clubs, of which there are hundreds around Britain, banded together to set up a Burns Federation, which exerted a benevolent or heavy-handed, depending on who you ask, force on the ways in which Burns was celebrated for the better part of the next century. The modern lineup at a Burns supper was now fully in place, with the Selkirk Grace creeping in during the latter part of the 19th century, the piping of the haggis well established by the time of the 1859 centenary, and the toast to the lassies being supplemented with a reply to the laddies as the supper gradually shed its initial all-male heavy-drinking roots. And interestingly, again, sort of thinking locally, the first documented reply to the laddies at a Burns supper was given in New York's Caledonian Club on Burns Night in 1876. So, all of this was not entirely without its critics. This increasingly monolithic way of performing Scottishness was never going to sit well with everybody. The most influential critic of the way the Burns supper had developed by the early 20th century was the poet Christopher Murray Grieve, can see on the screen there, better known by his literary pseudonym Hugh MacDermot. Grieve was part of the 20th century Scottish Renaissance, as it's called, a really remarkable outpouring of literary talent on the part of dozens of Scottish poets, novelists, and critics in the first part of the 20th century. Like Burns, he wrote in Scots, and like Burns, he played an important role in developing it as a living literary language. It was in November 1926 that Grieve published what's probably his magnum opus, the book-length poem A Drunk Man Looks the Thistle. At 2,685 lines of complex Scots, it's a long and challenging read, and in it Grieve addresses the nature of being Scottish, the nature of being human, and the cultural politics of the world he saw around him. This included both an acknowledgement of his own great debt to Burns as a poet, but also a tirade against Burns clubs and Burns suppers of the early 20th century, institutions that Grieve saw as evacuated of all meaning, full of empty phrases and self-satisfied elites parroting the words of a poet they didn't really understand. But MacDermot can say this much better than I can, and I quote, "No one in 50 kens a word Burns wrote, but misapplied as our buddy's property. And gin there was his like alive the day, they'd be the last a kennin' hon to gie. Cruise London Scotties with their braw shirt fronts and a' their fancy freens, rejoicing at similar gatherings in Timbuktu, Baghdad, and hell nae doot, are voicing Burns' sentiments of universal love in pidgin English or in wildfowl Scots, and toasting ane was not to them but an excuse for faithering genius wi' their thoughts. They've to say was aften said afore, a lad was born in Kyle to blaw boot. What unco fate makes him the dumpin' groon for all the sloppy rubbish they jaw out?" Now, I can read this not just as an attack on the complacency of the Burns tradition at this point, but as part of a larger attack that the younger generation were making on the whole romanticized, sentimental, slightly tawdry version of Scotland which had developed over the 19th century. Just as Burns had come to stand in for Scottish culture as a whole, so here in Grieve's mind at least, misappropriation of his memory came to stand in for the entire edifice of Victorian tartanified sentimentality, which is perhaps another story altogether. But as you can imagine, despite MacDermot's strong words, and despite the fact that a fair number of people agreed with him, you probably won't be too surprised that the Burns Supper tradition survived such attacks and is continuing strong today. The Burns Federation is alive and strong. You can see their Twitter there. And the commercial possibilities of Burns, which the Victorians were already well aware of, with their commemorative medals and tartans and plaques and punch bowls, continue to be made use of, whether that's by the Scottish Federation of Meat Traders, as you can see on the screen there, or by any number of other groups who thrive on the economy that surrounds Scottish culture. And of course, the Burns Supper itself continues to be an international phenomenon. Recently, some of my colleagues at the University of Glasgow have produced this, I think, really spectacular interactive map of Burns suppers held over the last few years. And I'd encourage you to follow the link and play around with it yourself. The screen cap doesn't really do it justice. And as you can see, within just the last decade or less, there are several thousand worldwide, from Svalbard to the tip of South America, even one in Antarctica, which apparently involved a tin of 40-year-old haggis. And I can't say as I'm sorry to miss that one. But I thought, again, sort of thinking about the context of RoundTable, you might be interested particularly to see how Burns suppers fared in New York. And there are a goodly number, as you can see. I'm certainly not familiar enough with the geography of the city to make any statements about what the addresses of the various suppers might tell us, but some certainly look as if they were rather on the exclusive end of the tradition. As in the case of the Caledonian Club's Burns Night, we can see up there pictured on the right, again, courtesy of the Glasgow Project. Remember, it was at the Caledonian Club that we first heard the reply to the laddies. But equally, I don't want to suggest that Burns Night has by any means become static or fossilized or the exclusive purview of the elites. I mean, of course it has in some contexts, as it always has, but it's also developed with changing cultural patterns across the world. And nowhere is this more wonderfully evident than in the Canadian phenomenon of gung haggis fat choy. This reinvention is the brainchild of Canadian Todd Wong of Vancouver, who was first exposed to what he quite accurately describes as, quote, this weird ethnic tradition, unquote, of Burns Night when he was a university student in the 90s. And a few years later, in 1998, Wong realized that Burns Night and the Chinese New Year fell only a couple of days apart. And of course, this changes from year to year. Sometimes the Chinese New Year falls on Burns Night itself. And so Wong decided to combine the two events in a celebration for some friends as Gung Haggis Fat Choi, playing on Gung Hei Fat Choi, the traditional Cantonese greeting used during the New Year. Now, much like Burns suppers, Gung Haggis started amongst a group of friends and rapidly spread, so that it's now widely celebrated across the western coast of North America and indeed in places in Scotland itself. It includes haggis wontons, which I've never had, which I'd absolutely love to try, and Burns poetry performed as rap, as well as elements of traditional Chinese New Year's celebrations. And to my mind, it and events like it are a fantastic example of the malleability and the potential of the Burns Supper as a cultural phenomenon, as well as an important antidote for the tendency of Burns Night, much like Grieve noted 100 years ago, to devolve into something overly ritualistic and stuffy. So, in conclusion, I hope that this has been an interesting, maybe even an entertaining introduction to Robert Burns and the tradition of Burns Night. And of course, sadly, Burns Night 2021 isn't exactly going to be the same as usual with much of the world in lockdown. Although if all this has piqued your interest, I know there are certainly many virtual Burns Nights being planned around the world, which could give everybody stuck at home some sense of the tradition and the sociability of the event. Or then again, you could also be like me and actually quite happy to have a slightly more chilled out Burns Night at home this year. And for the record, and speaking of modern innovations, on the 25th of January, I will be having haggis nachos. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Kelsey. That was fantastic. I know I've learned a ton in the past 30 minutes. You've crammed so much into such a concise presentation. Thank you. We have a ton of questions and comments that have already come in. But like I said, while we're still live and while we still have everyone here, I just want to remind you that if you haven't sent a question or comment our way yet, there's still ample time to do so. Should you be watching us on a computer screen, remember exit full screen mode, so make us small. To the right of the screen you see us on, there's a chat box. You can type whatever you'd like and click the blue chat button. If you're not on a computer, that's okay. There's always that email option. The address, one more time, is office@roundtableculturalseminars.org. Or there's that text option as well that Gina and I will get on our computers. The number again is 646-450-0986. There is still time, so if you have something you'd like to share or ask, please feel free to do so. But without further ado, our first question here, there's a lot, so forgive me as I take a moment to sort of scroll through and navigate. This one says, is Burns still revered, or has the holiday become more of a social event?
It's a really good question. And I think the answer is maybe a little bit in between the two. Burns is, I think, no longer revered with maybe the almost obsessive adoration that he was by Scots in the 19th century, but he's certainly still respected as a major figure, and I think almost any Scot you met could probably recite at least some of Burns's poetry, so he still occupies a very important cultural position. But by the same token, I think for most people, Burns Night is really an opportunity to have some nice food, some drink, some chat, some dancing, and a chance to get to see their friends.
A comment here actually from someone who has attended, I assume, the Gung Haggis Fat Choi Festival celebration in Seattle. They said they have attended that celebration, but they love his poetry, and this is the first time they've heard about the specific Burns Night celebration. So proof that you've taught somebody something today.
Right. I'm very envious that they've gotten to attend. This is definitely on my bucket list.
Me too. It sounds like it's a really, really exciting event. Another question here, it says, have any new poems been discovered and attributed to Burns?
Yes, they absolutely have. That's a really good question. There's been quite a lot of progress in recent decades. So with any poet who attracts a lot of literary criticism, there are continually being new editions of his poetry being published. Some of them sort of popular rehashes, some really digging into the original material. And at the moment, there's a large project going on to produce a new scholarly edition of Burns, which has revealed several new fragments of poetry. Nothing utterly earth-shattering, but enough to suggest that there is still Burns material out there.
Another question here via text. It says, is there a historic reason Scotland has so many celebrations in the month of January? Hogmanay, Uppelia, and Burns Night.
Oh yes, there absolutely is. It's because it's cold and it's damp and everybody's miserable and we need to do something to keep our spirits up. I do genuinely think that's largely the case.
We understand that here in New York. Maybe not as severely, but we understand the cold for sure. Another question here. It says, you mentioned Jamaica twice. Was there a significant Scotland-Jamaica link?
There was a very significant Scotland-Caribbean link, albeit not one that I think we're particularly fond of remembering, and that's due to Scotland's involvement in the slave trade. Glasgow was one of the centers, one of the sort of corners, I suppose you could say, of the Atlantic Triangle of the slave trade that saw slaves going from Africa to the New World, and which then saw the products of slave-worked plantations going to the Old World, particularly via Glasgow merchants. So in that respect, there was a great deal of movement back and forth between the Caribbean and the Southern American colonies from the west coast of Scotland, and that, again, is why Burns had his plans for immigration.
Couple more questions here. This says, I've heard the terms Scotch, Scots, and Scottish over the years. Will you clarify usage of all three in context, please?
Absolutely. That's another great question. It's one that Scots tend to get quite head up about, although I think largely we're probably being overly sensitive. So Scotch is probably the oldest term. You mostly see it in the 17th and 18th centuries when it was just what you would describe something that is Scottish. You might refer to a Scotchman, or you might refer to such and such a Scotch tradition or something. Gradually, and I have to admit, I don't actually know how it started, but gradually Scotch came to assume a pejorative attitude, particularly when it was used by an English person. And now tends to be avoided. I think, honestly, the only place where you still see it are largely in non-British contexts, where it's what whiskey from Scotland is called. Now we would probably say Scots or Scottish. I think either of those are absolutely fine. And I think you'd find people using both of them. I think perhaps Scots might be a slightly commoner way of referring to things within Scotland and Scottish out with. But I think both would be fairly normal.
Another question here via text. It says, we saw in the 18th and 19th century Shakespeare's works being rewritten for the public. Did Burns suffer the same fate?
Yes, he did. So Burns suffered a variety of fates, partly due to what I suggested earlier about how he didn't really fit people's ideas of what a poet like him should be. Sometimes this took the form of some gentle rewriting and bowdlerized additions. More dramatically, it took the form in quite a lot of his verse being suppressed, which is not really talked about until fairly recently. Amongst other things, Burns had a role in editing a work called The Merry Muses of Caledonia, which was largely a collection of bawdy poems he wrote for his drinking friends or that other people had collected. And this sort of thing was very much downplayed in the Burns tradition until comparatively recently.
Question here, it says, is contemporary Scots language similar to that of Burns?
Yes, it's fairly similar. So Scots is an interesting language for several reasons. One is that in spite of various people's attempts, it's never been nationally standardized. So the Scots that people will speak down the street from me in Fife is going to be different from the Scots people speak in Ayrshire or up north or elsewhere. And that means, so there's some places that are going to sound more Burnsian than others. But the other and slightly sad thing is that Scots has become an increasingly linguistically impoverished language. It really feels the pressure of English as a cognate language and is one that is much more widely known. So increasingly, especially in the younger generation, you see particularly Scots words dropping out of use and being replaced by English cognates. So in that respect, we have a more anglicized Scots in the 21st century than we would have in Burns's time.
This one says, what toasts are recommended for a Burns supper?
Well, the standard ones would be to the immortal memory of Robert Burns, which is usually at the end then of the immortal memory speech, and usually a toast to the lassies, again, after the address to the lassies. And then beyond that, it kind of varies in terms of your personal preference. Certainly in the Victorian period, a toast to the monarch was quite standard. And I've been given to understand by friends who've gone to Burns suppers in the States that sometimes you have a nice mashup with a toast both to the Queen and the President. But I think, yeah, beyond the toast to Burns himself, that's everything else is more or less optional.
The questions keep coming in. This one says, do we know of any living descendants?
That's an excellent question. Several of Burns's children lived into adulthood, and he definitely were definitely living grandchildren at the end of the 19th century. It wouldn't surprise me if there were living descendants now, but I honestly don't know. If so, they're less central to the Burns tradition than his children and grandchildren were.
Another one here, it says, is there a political aspect to Burns, particularly in regard to Scots-British relations?
Well, this is very interesting because, as I'd suggested earlier in my talk, Burns has very much been the football of different parts of Scottish society wanting to sort of present different images of Burns. And indeed, perhaps one of the you can even see this in the present day, and that perhaps one of the leading Scottish academics who's a prominent unionist politically and publicly has also written a great deal on Burns and about Burns's sort of connection to unionism. So that sort of thing is continuing on. Burns himself was broadly anti-union, broadly radical, broadly quite a lot of things that nobody particularly liked in the 1790s, but that has been largely elided over in most people's understanding of the Burns tradition. Most people don't see Burns as a sort of particularly anti-English or anti-union phenomenon today. Indeed, I think you probably find plenty of English men and women who are as familiar with and appreciative of Burns as Scots.
The comment here, apparently we do have some haggis fans out there. It says, the haggis I had was delicious.
Excellent.
And one final question, if you don't mind. It says, where will you be having haggis nachos?
I will be having them sitting on my sofa with my wife, Skyping some friends of ours who used to live in Scotland and now in Cornwall. Not terribly dramatic, I'm afraid.
We make do with what we have, right? Well, that is all the questions we have for right now. As we continue with the program, though, should you think of any questions, know that there's also that email option or that text option. You can send them to us and we can get them to Kelsey should you think of anything as we continue through. But that being said, since we've just learned about all the celebrations and poems that accompany this legendary man, let's get to another performance here. We're going to watch Angie Cassidy. She is a Glasgow-based performer and actor. And for us, she is going to be doing To a Mouse. So we'll say thank you so much to Kelsey. This was really, really fantastic. And we'll turn it over to Angie and watch her.
Thank you.
Wee, sleek-it, cowering, timorous beastie. Oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou needna start away sae hasty wi' bicker and brattle. I would be laith to run and chase thee wi' murder and pattle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion that makes thee startle at me, thy poor earthborn companion and fellow mortal. I doubt na whiles that thou may thieve. What then? Poor beastie, thou maun live. A daemon icker and a thrave's a small request. I'll get a blessing with a lave, and never missed. Thou wee bit hussy too, in ruin. As silly was the winds are strewing, and naething now to big anew in a foggage green. And bleak December's winds it soon, baith snail and keen. Thou saw the fields laid bare and waste, and weary winter coming fast. And cosy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash, the cruel coulter passed out through thy cell. And that wee bit heap of leaves and stibble has cost thee mony a weary nibble. And thou's cast out for all thy trouble, but hoose or hald, to thole the sleety winter dribble, and Cranrach called. But Moosey, thou art no thy lane, in proving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared with me. The present only toucheth thee, but och, I backward cast my eye on prospects drear, and forward, though I canna see, I guess and fear.
How perfect was that? Angie even had the setting to go with her poem in the background. We'll keep moving along though. Next up, we have Josh Whitelaw, who is also a Glasgow-based actor and performer. He is reciting the author's earnest cry and prayer for us. Keep an eye on it. You might recognize him. His credits include Outlander. So take a close look, and we'll have him up on the screen right now.
Ye Irish lords, ye knights and squires, we represents our brothers and shires, and dousely manage our affairs in Parliament. To you, a simple poet's prayers are humbly sent. Alas, my rampant muse is hearse. Your honour's hearts with grief twad pierce, to see her sitting on her arse, low the dust, and screeching out prosaic verse, and like to burst. Tell them wha hae the chief direction. Scotland and me's in great affliction. Ere sin they laid that cursed restriction on acquivity, and rouse them up to strong conviction and move their pity. Stand forth and tell yon Premier Youth the honest, open, naked truth. Tell him of mine and Scotland's druth. Our hot servants humble, the muckle devil blaw you sooth if he dissemble. Does ony great man glunch and gloom? Speak out and never fash your thumb. Let posts and pensions sink or swoon, with them wha grant them. If honestly they cannae come, far better want them. And gathering votes ye werena slack, now stand as tightly by your tack. Ne'er claw your lug and fidge your back and hum and haw, but raise your arm and tell your crack before them all. Paint Scotland, greeting o'er her thistle, or much can stoup his tombs a whistle, and damned excise men in a bustle, seizing a stelg, triumphant crushing like a mussel or a lampant shell. Then on the t'other hand present her a blackguard smuggler right behind her, and cheek for chow a chuffy vintner colleague and join, picking her pouch as bare as winter of a kind coin. Is there that bears the name of Scot, but feels his heart blood rising hot to see his poor old mother's pot thus dung in staves, and plundered o'er her hindmost groat by gallows caves? Alas, but I'm a nameless wight, trode o' the mire out of sight, but could I, like Montgomery's fight, or gab like Boswell, there's some sark necks I would draw tight, and tie some hose well. God bless your honours, can ye see it? That kind old canty Carlin greet. And no get warmly to your feet, and gar them hear it, and tell them wi' a patriot teat ye winna bear it. Some of you nicely ken the laws to round the period and pause, and with rhetoric clause on clause to mark harangues. Then echo through St. Stephen's was old Scotland's ranks. Arouse, my boys, exert your mettle to get old Scotland back her kettle, or faith, I'll wad my new plue petal, you'll see it her lang, she'll teach ye wi' a reeking whittle another sang. Old Scotland has a rocko tongue, she's just a devil wi' a rung, and if she promise old her young to tak their part, though by the neck she should be strung, she'll no desert. And now ye chosen 45 may still your mother's heart support ye. Then, though a minister grow doughty and kick your place, you snap your fingers poor and hearty before his face. God bless your honours all your days, with soups o' kale and brats o' clays, in spite of the thievish cays that haunt St. Jamie's. Your humble poet sings in praise, while Rab his name is.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much to Josh for sending that to us. Again, that was Josh Whitelaw. He is a Glasgow-based actor. He is just fantastic. And as we said, he did appear on Outlander, if anyone is an Outlander fan. And I promise I did not do this intentionally, but the second piece of bagpipe music that we have for you is from the Bagpipe Master. He runs a website for bagpipe education where he teaches you how to play the bagpipes. And he also has some amazing performance videos. We're going to send you all of that. Once we've finished with our program today, you'll get a follow-up email where you can explore the Dark Isle Piper and the Bagpipe Master. And I'm going to link you to Kelsey's website too. He has a fantastic website if you want to keep up with Kelsey. And as you can see, my background has changed. One of the work from home challenges is sometimes people are on other calls where you are. So I went into a different room. That being said, I'm going to take the Bagpipe Master on screen with us to perform the Skyboat song, which if you watch Outlander, you will recognize. But it's such a fantastic song, and it has a really, really interesting history. If you're interested in looking that up, it is a really fascinating story about that song. So I'm going to take Caitlin and myself off screen, and we're going to go to the Skyboat song with the Bagpipe Master. So thank you to the Bagpipe Master for giving us that wonderful performance. We are going to finish up with one of my personal favorites, Tam O'Shanter. And this is a bit of a longer poem. And the system that we use to stream to you, StreamYard, will only let us upload 10 minutes at a time. And it's a bit over 10 minutes. So it's cut into two parts. So if it goes black really quick, it'll be right back with the second half. This is being performed by Kenny Ritchie. And I cannot tell you how overjoyed I am to share this piece with you. Before we get to Kenny and Tam O'Shanter, I just want to remind everybody that we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we've been offering a lot more complimentary programming since we have been online due to the pandemic. It is our goal to keep doing that, to make that a permanent part of who we are as an institution. If you would like to support RoundTable in furthering this mission, bringing educational opportunities to adults from all over the world, you can do so. You can support RoundTable by making a 100% tax-deductible contribution, and there's our mailing address. This is also available on our website, and we'll follow it up in an email afterwards. Thank you again to all of our participants that are joining us, everybody new. We are so thankful to have you with us, and we would appreciate any support in an amount that is meaningful to you to help us continue on our mission. That being said, I am going to take Caitlin and myself off screen. We're going to say goodbye to you. We're going to say cheers to a Burns night. I hope that you all can have your own Burns night supper on the 25th. And I'm going to send us out with Kenny Ritchie performing Tam O'Shanter. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you for our next event sometime soon. Keep an eye on the mailing list. Here we go, Kenny.
When Chapman Billies leave the street, and drouthy neighbours meet, when market days are drawing late, and folk begin to tack the gate, while we sit boozing at the nappy, getting fou and unca happy, we think knowing the lang Scots miles, the mosses, water, slaps and stiles that lie between us and our hame, where sits our sulky, sullen dame, gathering her brows like gathering storm, nursing her wrath to keep it warm. This truth found honest Tam O'Shanter, as he frae air aye night did canter. Old air, which ne'er a tune surpasses for honest men and bonny lasses. Oh Tam, had thou but been so wise as ta'e thy ain wife Kate's advice, she told thee well there was a skellum, a bletherin, blusterin, drunken blellum, that frae November to October, aye market day thou wasna sober. That ilka melder with a miller, thou sat as long as thou had siller. That every horse was caught a shoe on, that smith and thee got roaring fou on. And at the Lord's house, even on Sunday, thou drank with Captain Jean till Monday. She prophesied that late or soon thou wouldst be found deep drowned in Doon, or ta'en by warlocks in the mirk at Alloway's old haunted kirk. Oh, gentle dames, it gars me greet to think how many counsels sweet, how many lengthened, sage advices the husband for the wife despises. But to our tale, aye market night, Tam would get planted unca right, fast by the ingle blazing finely, with reemin swats that drank divinely. And at his elbow, Suitor Johnny, his ancient trusty drouthy crony. Tam looed him like a very brother. They had been through for weeks together. The night drave on with songs and clatter, and aye, the ale was getting better. The landlady and Tam grew gracious, with favours secret, sweet and precious. The suitor told his queerest stories. The landlord's laugh made ready chorus. Outside, the storm might rear and rustle. Tam didn't mind the storm a whistle. Care, mad to see a man sae happy, he'd drowned himself among the nappy. As bees fly hame with loads of treasure, the moments winged the hours with pleasure. Kings may be blessed, but Tam was glorious, o'er all the ills of life victorious. But pleasures are like poppies spread. You grasp the flower, the bloom is shed. Or like a snowfall in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. Or like the Borealis race that flits ere we can point their place. Or like the rainbow's lovely form, vanishing within the storm. Nae man can tether time nor tide. The hour approaches, Tam mun ride. That hour of night's black arch, the key stain. That dreary hour he mounts his beast in. And second hour, he takes the road in, as ne'er poor sinner was abroad in. The wind blew as would blow its last, the rattling showers rose in the blast, the speedy gleams the darkness swallowed, loud, deep and lang the thunder bellowed. That night a child might understand, the deil had business at his hand. Wheel mounted on his grey mare Meg, a better never lifted leg, Tam skelpit on through dump and mire, despising wind and rain and fire, whilst holding fast his good blue bonnet, whilst crooning o'er an old Scots sonnet, while glowering round with prudent cares, lest bogles catch him unawares. Kirk Alloway was drawing nigh, where ghaists and hoolits nightly cry. By this time he had passed the ford, where in the snow the chapman smoored, and by the bucks and meikle stane, where drunken Charlie breaks neck bane, and through the winds and near the cairn, where hunters found a murdered bairn, and near the thorn aboon the well, where Mungo's mother hanged hersel. Before him, Doon pours a' his floods, the rattling storm roars through the woods, the lightnings flash from pole to pole, near and more near the thunders roll, when, glimmering through the glowing trees, Kirkalloway seemed all ablaze. Through ilka bore the beams were glancing, and loud resounded mirth and dancing. Inspiring, bold John Barleycorn, what dangers thou canst make us scorn. With tuppenny, we fear nae evil. With ushke ba, we face the devil. The swat say reamed in Tammy's noddle. Fair played, he caredna deals a boddle. But Maggie stood, right sair astonished, till by the healing hand admonished, she ventured forward to the light, and vow, Tam saw an unca sight. Warlocks and witches in a dance. Nae cotillion brent new frae France, but hornpipes, jigs, spades and reels put life and metal in their heels. A winnock bunker to the east, there sat Auld Nick in shape a beast, a towsy tyke, black, grim and large. To gie the music was his charge. He screwed his pipes and gat them skirl, till roof and rafter all did dirl. Coffins stood round like open presses that showed the dead in their last dresses, and by some devilish cantrip slight, each in its cold hand held a light, by which heroic Tam was able to view upon the holy table a murderer's banes and gibbet airns, twa span long wee unchristened bairns. A thief new cutted frae the rape, with his last gasp his gab did gape. 5 tomahawks with blood red rusted, 5 scimitars with murder crusted, a garter that a babe had strangled, a knife a father's throat had mangled, whom his ain son o' life bereft, the grey hairs yet stuck to the heft, and mair wi' horrible and awful, the e'en to mention were unlawful. As Tammy stood, amazed and curious, the mirth and fun grew fast and furious. The piper loud and louder blew. The dancers quick and quicker flew. They reeled, they set, they crossed, they tweak it, till ilka carlin swat and reek it, and cast their ditties to the wark, and link it at it in her sark. Oh, Tam, now Tam, had these been quines, all plump and strapping in their teens, their sarks instead of creashy flannin, been snow white 1700 linen. There, breeks o' mine, my only pair, the aints were plush o' good blue hair, and to gain them off my hearties, for I blink o' the bonny birdies. But with their beldams, old and droll, rigwoody hags would speen a foal, louping and flinging in a crummock. I wonder didn't he turn your stomach? But Tam knew what was what right brawly. There was I winsome lass and Wally that night enlisted in the corps. Lang after Kent and Carrick shore, for many a beastie dead she shot, and perished many a bonny boat, and shoot both meikle corn and beer, and kept the countryside in fear. Her cutty sark of Paisley harm, that whilst a lassie she is worn, in longitude though sairly scanty, it was her best, and she was vaunty. Ah, little Kent, thy reverent granny, that sark she coughed for her wee nanny, with 2 pounds Scots. It was all riches, would e'er grease the dancel witches. But now my muse, her wingman cour, sick flights are far beyond her poor, to sing how nanny lap and flang, a supple jade she was and strang. and how Tam stood like ane bewitched, and thought he's very een enriched. Een Satan glowered and fitched fu fain, and hocht and blew and might and main, till first one caper, syne another, Tam tint his reason all together and roars out, "Well done, Cutty Sark!" And in an instant, all was dark. And scarcely had he Maggie rallied, when forth the hellish legion sallied, like bees fly out in angry fight when plundering herds assail their bike, as open pussies mortal foes when pop she starts before their nose. As eager runs the market crowd when "Catch the thief" resounds aloud, so Maggie runs, the witches follow, with many an eldritch screech and hollow. Oh, Tam, now Tam, thou get thou faring, in hell they'll roast thee like a herring. In vain thy Kate awaits thy coming, Kate soon will be a woeful woman. Now do thy speed the utmost, Meg, to mak the key stain o' the brig. There at them thou thy tail may toss, a running stream they durn across. But ere the key stain she could make, the fainter tail she had to shake. For Nanny, far before the rest, hard upon noble Maggie pressed, and flew at Tam with furious ettle. But little was she Maggie's mettle. I leap brang aff her master hail, but left a hint her ain grey tail. The carlin caught her by the rump, and left poor Maggie scarce a stump. Now, who this tale of truth may read, each man and mother's son tak heed. If e'er to drink ye are inclined, or Cutty Sarks run through your mind, think ye may buy your joys o'er dear. Remember Tam O'Shanter's mare.